The sound of shattering crystal silenced the entire dining room of the Kensington. It wasn't just a wine glass hitting the floor. It was the composure of London's most feared business tycoon, Catherine Pembroke. One glimpse of a tarnished silver locket hanging around a waitress's neck turned an iron-willed billionaire into a sobbing, trembling mess in front of 50 witnesses. But that locket didn't just hold a sentimental photo. It held the key to a 40-year-old crime, a faked death, and an inheritance worth killing for. This is the true, twisted story of how a spilled drop of red wine revealed a dynasty's darkest secret. You will not believe who the waitress actually was. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows of the Kensington, London's most exclusive private dining club. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax, truffle oil, and old money. For Shannon Miller, a 24-year-old waitress with aching feet and a bank account hovering in the negatives, the luxury was suffocating. She adjusted the collar of her stiff black uniform, trying to hide the fraying hem of her sleeve. She had been working double shifts for 3 weeks straight to pay off her mother's medical bills, and exhaustion hung on her like a heavy coat. Tonight was not a night for mistakes. The entire restaurant staff had been briefed 3 times before the doors even opened. The VIP guest list was short, but it carried the weight of the British economy. At table 4, the centre of gravity in the room, sat Catherine Pembroke. Catherine was 78 years old, though her sharp eyes and rigid posture suggested a woman who had stopped aging out of sheer stubbornness. She was the matriarch of the Pembroke Hotel Group, a woman who had tripled her family's fortune after her husband's mysterious death in the 90s. They called her the Iron Queen in the tabloids. She was known for firing executives for typos and buying out competitors just to shut them down. Sitting opposite Catherine was her nephew, Charles, a man in his late 40s with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Charles was the heir apparent. He checked his Rolex every 3 minutes, his foot tapping impatiently beneath the white tablecloth. "The merger needs your signature by morning, Aunt Catherine," Charles said, his voice smooth but insistent. "The board is getting restless. They think you're hesitating." Catherine sliced her steak with surgical precision, not looking up. "The board thinks what I tell them to think, Charles, and you will wait until I am ready." Shannon approached the table, balancing a heavy silver tray. Her hands trembled slightly, a combination of caffeine withdrawal and the terrifying aura radiating from Catherine Pembroke. Shannon had been warned by the maître d', a nervous man named Henri, that Pembroke had once demanded a waiter be fired because his cologne was too musky. "More Pinot Noir, madame?" Shannon asked, her voice barely a whisper. Catherine didn't respond. She merely tapped the rim of her glass with a manicured fingernail. Shannon moved in. As she leaned forward to pour the vintage wine, the top button of her blouse, loosened because of the stifling heat in the kitchen, gave way. It didn't pop off, but it slipped just enough. As she tilted the bottle, a necklace that Shannon always kept tucked beneath her uniform swung free. It was an unusual piece. It wasn't the kind of jewelry a waitress on minimum wage usually wore. It was an oval locket made of heavy, tarnished platinum, engraved with a very specific, twisted ivy pattern. Embedded in the center was a tiny, rough-cut emerald that looked almost black in the dim light. The bottle clinked against the glass. Catherine looked up, annoyed by the sound. "Careful, girl. That wine costs more than your—" Catherine's voice died in her throat. Her eyes, usually cold and assessing, locked onto the swinging locket. The color drained from her face so instantly, it looked as if she had passed away right there in the chair. Her fork clattered onto the china plate, the noise echoing like a gunshot in the hushed room. Shannon froze, the bottle hovering mid-air. I'm so sorry, madame. I didn't mean to disturb." Catherine didn't hear her. She began to shake. It started with her hands, then her shoulders. A guttural sound, something between a gasp and a scream, clawed its way out of her chest. "Where?" Catherine whispered, her voice unrecognizable. She stood up, her chair scraping violently backward. "Where did you get that?" Charles looked up, annoyed. "Aunt Catherine, what is it? It's just a clumsy waitress." Catherine ignored him. She reached out, her hand trembling violently, and grabbed the locket around Shannon's neck. Shannon flinched, pulling back, terrified. She dropped the wine bottle. It smashed against the table edge, sending a spray of dark red liquid across the pristine tablecloth and onto Catherine's cream silk blouse. "Madame," Henry, the maitre d', came running from the shadows. "I am so sorry. Shannon, get back. Security." But Catherine Pembroke held on to the locket with a grip of steel. She wasn't looking at the spilled wine. She wasn't looking at the terrified staff. She was staring into Shannon's eyes with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. "It's impossible," Catherine choked out, tears suddenly streaming down her perfectly powdered face, ruining her makeup. "You're dead. You're supposed to be dead." The restaurant went silent. Charles stood up, his face darkening. "Aunt Catherine, sit down. You're having an episode. Henri, get her water." "No!" Catherine shrieked, shoving Charles away with surprising strength. She yanked Shannon closer, pulling the waitress down so their faces were inches apart. "Who gave this to you? Tell me. Did you steal it? Did you dig it up?" "I didn't steal it," Shannon cried, panic rising in her chest. She tried to unclasp Catherine's fingers from the chain, but the old woman was hysterical. "Let go of me. It's mine. It's always been mine." "Liar!" Catherine screamed, and then her legs gave out. The billionaire matriarch collapsed to the floor, dragging Shannon down with her. Catherine curled into a ball, clutching the hem of Shannon's apron, sobbing uncontrollably. It was a sound of raw, ancient grief that made the wealthy patrons uncomfortable in their seats. "My Arthur!" Catherine wailed into the carpet. "My baby boy! I saw him burn! I saw it!" Charles was instantly beside her, but he wasn't looking at his aunt with concern. He was looking at Shannon, and for a split second, Shannon saw something in his eyes that terrified her more than Catherine's screaming. It was recognition, and it was pure hatred. "Get her out of here!" Charles hissed at the security guards who had just arrived. He pointed a shaking finger at Shannon. "She attacked Mrs. Pembroke. She tried to rob her. Call the police, now." 30 minutes later, Shannon sat in the manager's cramped office at the back of the restaurant. Her uniform was stained with wine, and her wrists stung where the security guard, a brute named Preston, had clamped handcuffs on her. They weren't police handcuffs. They were heavy-duty zip ties. Preston stood by the door, arms crossed, staring at her as if she were a terrorist. Henry, the manager, was pacing back and forth, sweating profusely. "This is the end," he muttered to himself. "The Pembrokes will sue us into oblivion." "Shannon, what were you thinking? Assaulting Catherine Pembroke?" "I didn't touch her," Shannon pleaded, tears stinging her eyes. "She grabbed me. She went crazy over my necklace." "The necklace you stole," Preston grunted from the door. "I didn't steal it," Shannon yelled, her frustration boiling over. "I've had it since I was a baby. It was in the blanket when they found me." The door swung open. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Charles walked in. He had regained his composure. He smoothed his tie, looking at Shannon with a calm, predatory detachment. Behind him, 2 uniformed police officers waited in the hallway, but Charles closed the door on them. "Leave us," Charles said to Henri and Preston. "Sir, the police are—" Henri started. "I said, leave us," Charles repeated, his voice low and dangerous. I need to ascertain the extent of the theft before we file formal charges." Henry and Preston scrambled out of the room. Charles locked the door and turned to Shannon. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He walked over to the desk, pulled out a chair, and sat down opposite her. "Let's cut the theatrics, shall we?" Charles said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a packet of cigarettes, lighting one despite the strict no-smoking laws. "My aunt is currently sedated in her limousine. Her doctor says the shock was severe. At her age, that could be considered attempted manslaughter." Shannon pulled against the zip ties. "I want a lawyer. You can't keep me here." "I can do whatever I want, darling. I own the building this restaurant leases." Charles smiled thinly. "Now, the necklace. Hand it over." "No," Shannon said, clutching the locket against her chest with her bound hands. "It belongs to the Pembroke family," Charles said, leaning forward. "It was buried with my cousin, Arthur, in 1984. He died in a fire at the summer estate in Cornwall. He was 3 years old. That locket was on his body." Shannon went cold. That's not possible." "Exactly," Charles said. "Which means you are a grave robber, or you bought it from one. Either way, you are going to prison for a very long time. Unless—" He paused, letting the smoke drift toward her face. "Unless what?" Shannon whispered. "Unless you give it to me right now, sign a confession that you stole it from a pawn shop and disappear from London tonight. I'll give you £10,000 cash. You leave, you never come back, and you never speak the name Pembroke again." Shannon's heart hammered against her ribs. It made no sense. If she was a thief, why offer her money? Why not just let the police arrest her? Charles wasn't angry about the theft. He was desperate to get the necklace. Suddenly, a memory flashed in Shannon's mind. The orphanage matron, Mrs. Gable, handing her the locket when she turned 18. "This was with you, Shannon, and this letter. But the letter is water-damaged. We could never read it. Keep the locket safe. It's the only link to who you are." Shannon looked at Charles. She saw the sweat on his upper lip. He was afraid. "Who was Arthur?" Shannon asked, her voice steadying. Charles's eye twitched. "My cousin, the heir. But he died. And my aunt went mad with grief. She's been seeing ghosts for 40 years. If she sees that locket again, it will kill her. I am trying to protect her." "You're lying," Shannon said. It was a guess, but it landed. Charles stood up abruptly, knocking the chair over. "You stupid girl. You have no idea what you've walked into." He lunged for her, reaching for her neck to rip the chain off. Shannon screamed and kicked out, her heavy work boot connecting with his shin. Charles howled in pain and stumbled back. At that exact moment, the door handle rattled violently. "Open this door! Police!" The door was kicked open, but it wasn't the police who entered first. It was an elderly man in a chauffeur's uniform, supporting a trembling, pale Catherine Pembroke. She looked frail, but her eyes were burning with a terrifying intensity. "Get away from her, Charles," Catherine commanded. Her voice was weak, but it carried the authority of a woman who could buy and sell everyone in the room. "Aunt Catherine, stay back," Charles stammered, backing away from Shannon. "She's dangerous. I was just getting the evidence." "The only dangerous thing in this room is you," Catherine said. She hobbled forward, ignoring the police officers who were trying to figure out the situation. She stopped in front of Shannon. Catherine reached into her purse and pulled out a small, folding pocket knife. The police officers tensed, hands on their tasers. "Ma'am, drop the knife!" an officer shouted. Catherine ignored him. She reached out and sliced the zip ties binding Shannon's wrists. The plastic snapped. Shannon rubbed her wrists, looking up at the billionaire with wide eyes. "Show me," Catherine whispered, tears pooling in her eyes again. "Please open it." Shannon hesitated, then reached for the locket. Her fingers fumbled with the tiny clasp. With a soft click, the oval silver piece popped open. Inside, on the left, was a tiny, water-damaged photo of a smiling baby boy, but on the right, engraved into the metal, were 3 initials and a date. AJP, 12/05/1981. Catherine let out a sob that sounded like a prayer. She looked at Shannon, really looked at her. She traced the line of Shannon's jaw, then her own. "Arthur didn't die in the fire," Catherine whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. She turned to Charles, who was now backed into the corner of the room, looking like a trapped rat. "The body was burned beyond recognition," Catherine said, her voice rising to a shout. "You identified him, Charles. You and your father. You told me it was my Arthur. But it wasn't, was it?" The room fell deadly silent. "Shannon," Catherine said, turning back to the waitress. "That locket was worn by my son. But he was a boy. If he had lived—" She paused, confusion clouding her face. You can't be Arthur." Shannon shook her head. "No, I'm not Arthur." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the only other thing she had kept from the orphanage. A folded, yellowed piece of paper. "But," Shannon said, her voice trembling, "I think Arthur might have been my father." The police officers in the manager's office were confused, looking between the billionaire matriarch, the weeping waitress, and the defiant executive. But Catherine Pembroke had not built an empire by letting confusion reign. She snapped the pocket knife shut and slipped it into her purse, her demeanor shifting from hysterical grief to cold, calculated command. "Officers," Catherine said, her voice like cracking ice. "There has been a misunderstanding. This young woman is my guest. My nephew was just explaining security protocols. Aggressively." Charles straightened his suit jacket, his face a mask of faux concern. "Aunt Catherine, you are clearly unwell. This girl is a con artist. That letter is a forgery. You need to come home and take your medication." "I am going home," Catherine replied, linking her arm through Shannon's, gripping the waitress tight. "And Shannon is coming with me." "She is a waitress," Charles barked, losing his cool for a fraction of a second. "You can't just abduct staff members." "I quit," Shannon said. Her voice was shaky, but the adrenaline was sharpening her senses. She looked at Charles, and she saw the terror behind his eyes. He wasn't worried about his aunt's health. He was worried about the yellowed piece of paper in Shannon's hand. Catherine signaled to her chauffeur. "Edward, escort us to the car. If Charles tries to stop us, break his arm." Edward, a burly man who had been with the Pembrokes since the 70s, nodded grimly. He stepped between Charles and the women. Charles could only watch, his jaw clenched, as his multi-billion-dollar future walked out the door in a wine-stained apron. The ride to the Pembroke estate was silent for a long time. The limousine glided through the rainy London streets, insulating them from the noise of the city. Shannon sat on the plush leather seat, feeling like an imposter. She looked down at her hands, still red from the zip ties. Catherine sat opposite her, staring at Shannon with an intensity that was unnerving. She poured a glass of water from the car's crystal decanter and handed it to Shannon. "Drink," Catherine said gently. "You're in shock." Shannon took a sip. "Mrs. Pembroke, I don't understand. If your son died in 1984, how could he be my father? I was born in 2000. Catherine looked out the window at the passing streetlights. Arthur was 5 years old when the fire happened. It was at our summer home in Cornwall. The entire East Wing collapsed. Charles's father, my brother-in-law Hugo, was the one who found the body. He said it was Arthur. The dental records matched. I was so medicated, so broken. I never looked. I couldn't bear to see my burnt boy. She turned back to Shannon, her eyes hard. But Hugo always wanted the company. When my husband died, Hugo thought he would inherit. Instead, it went to me and Arthur. With Arthur dead, Charles became the heir apparent. Shannon unfolded the yellowed paper. This letter, the matron at the orphanage said it was found in the basket I was left in. It's barely readable. Catherine turned on the reading light. She took the paper with trembling hands. The ink was faded, washed out by rain and time, but a few words were still visible in a frantic, scrawled handwriting. Not safe. They found us. Mother, if you ever... Her name is Shannon. Hide her. Charles knows. Catherine let out a sharp gasp. This isn't Arthur's handwriting. He was a child when I lost him. Then whose is it? Shannon asked. It looks like a man's handwriting, Catherine whispered. She traced the word mother. If Arthur survived, if Hugo and Charles lied about the body, he would have been 21 when you were born. The realization filled the car with a heavy, suffocating silence. Arthur hadn't died. He had been hidden, or he had run away, and for 20 years he had been out there, alive, while Catherine mourned a grave that contained a stranger. Why didn't he come back? Catherine wept softly. Why didn't he tell me? Maybe he couldn't, Shannon said, a dark thought forming. The letter says Charles knows. Maybe Charles knew he was alive the whole time. The limousine slowed as it approached the massive iron gates of the Pembroke estate. It was a fortress of stone and ivy looming against the night sky. We are going to find out, Catherine said, wiping her tears. The frailty was gone. The Iron Queen was back. But first, we need to make sure you stay alive long enough to take a DNA test. Charles is desperate, and a desperate man is capable of anything. As the gates closed behind them, Shannon looked back. A black sedan had been following them for the last 3 miles. It stopped just outside the gate, idling in the darkness, its headlights cutting through the rain like predator eyes. The Pembroke estate was more like a museum than a home. The hallways were wide enough to drive a car through, lined with portraits of ancestors who all seemed to be frowning. Shannon was given a guest suite that was larger than the entire apartment she shared with 3 roommates. She showered, scrubbing the smell of the restaurant and the fear off her skin. Catherine had provided her with silk pajamas and a heavy velvet robe. When Shannon looked in the bathroom mirror, she didn't recognize herself. The exhausted waitress was gone. In her place was a girl with striking green eyes that, she now realized, looked terrifyingly similar to the woman downstairs. There was a knock at the door. It was Robert, the head of Catherine's private security. He was a tall man with graying hair and a scar running through his eyebrow. "Miss Miller," Robert said, his voice low. "Mrs. Pembroke is waiting for you in the library. I've been instructed to stay outside your door tonight. Don't open it for anyone but me or Catherine." "Is it that bad?" Shannon asked, tightening her robe. "Charles Pembroke has already called the board of directors," Robert said grimly. "He is claiming Catherine has dementia. He's trying to trigger a clause to strip her of her power immediately. He says she's bringing homeless con artists into the manor. We have maybe 24 hours before he freezes the assets." Shannon followed Robert down the grand staircase to the library. Catherine was standing by the fireplace, pacing. The room was filled with books, but on the large oak table, files were spread out. "Come here, Shannon," Catherine said. She pointed to a file. "This is the police report from 1984. The fire." Shannon looked at the grainy black and white photos of a burning mansion. "The report says the fire started due to faulty wiring in the nursery," Catherine said. "But look at this." She pointed to a supplementary witness statement that had been buried in the back of the file. It was from a gardener who had been fired 2 days later. Statement: I saw a car leave the back gate 10 minutes before the smoke started. A blue Jaguar. Mr. Hugo's car. Hugo took him, Shannon whispered. He didn't kill him in the fire. He kidnapped him. To hold him as leverage against me, Catherine deduced, her eyes burning with rage. Hugo probably told me Arthur was dead so I wouldn't look for him. He kept my son somewhere, raised him in secret, or dumped him. But Arthur escaped, Shannon said, touching the locket around her neck. He must have. He met my mother. I don't remember a father. My mum died when I was 4. I went into the system after that. But she told me once that my dad was a prince in hiding. We need proof, Catherine said. The DNA test will take 48 hours. We don't have that kind of time. Charles is moving fast. Suddenly, the lights in the library flickered and died. The entire mansion plunged into darkness. "Robert!" Catherine shouted. "Stay down!" Robert's voice came from the hallway, followed by the sound of a struggle. A heavy thud shook the heavy oak doors. "They're inside!" Shannon gasped, backing away from the door. "The panic room!" Catherine hissed. She grabbed Shannon's hand and pulled her toward a false bookshelf in the corner of the library. Catherine yanked a specific book, Great Expectations, and the shelf swung open to reveal a steel door. They scrambled inside just as the library doors were kicked open. Through the hidden slat, Shannon saw the beams of flashlights cutting through the dark library. 2 men dressed in black tactical gear, faces covered, swept the room. They weren't police. They were cleaners. "She's not here," one voice crackled over a radio. "Check the upstairs. Make it look like a burglary gone wrong. Fatalities are authorized." Shannon clamped a hand over her mouth to stop a scream. Catherine was trembling, but she was typing furiously on a keypad on the wall of the panic room. "Who are they?" Shannon whispered. "Mercenaries," Catherine replied softly. "Charles isn't waiting for the board meeting. He's trying to kill us tonight." Catherine hit a final button. "I've just triggered the silent alarm to Scotland Yard and the private security rapid response team, but they are 10 minutes out." "We have to wait," Shannon said. "No," Catherine said, looking at a monitor on the wall that showed camera feeds from around the house. "Look." On one of the screens, in the hallway outside the library, Robert was lying on the floor, unconscious. One of the intruders was kneeling over him, injecting something into his neck. "They're killing my men," Catherine said. She reached into a gun safe built into the panic room wall and pulled out a heavy revolver. "I built this company from nothing, Shannon. I fought unions, recessions, and hostile takeovers. I will not let my nephew murder my family in my own house." "You can't go out there," Shannon cried. "You're 78. "I'm a Pembroke," Catherine said, checking the chamber of the gun. "And so are you. There's a back exit to this tunnel. It comes out in the garage. Take the keys to the Aston Martin. Drive to the police station. Show them the locket. I'm not leaving you. You are the only proof that Arthur lived," Catherine snapped. "If you die, the truth dies. Go!" Catherine pushed Shannon toward the dark tunnel at the back of the panic room. Then she turned back to the steel door, unlocking it. She was going to act as the distraction. Shannon stumbled into the dark tunnel, tears streaming down her face. She crawled through the narrow space, smelling damp earth and old concrete. She could hear gunshots ringing out behind her in the library. Bang! Bang! Then silence. Shannon burst out of the tunnel into the cold, cavernous garage. Her lungs were burning. She saw the Aston Martin parked in the corner, but she didn't run to it. Standing in the middle of the garage, lit by the dim emergency lights, was Charles. He was holding a pistol, casually, at his side. He looked impeccable, not a hair out of place, contrasting wildly with the chaos he had orchestrated upstairs. "I knew the panic room had a tunnel," Charles said smoothly. "I looked at the blueprints years ago. Aunt Catherine always was predictable." Shannon froze. She was trapped. "Where is she?" Shannon screamed. "What did you do to her?" "She's fine for the moment," Charles said, taking a step forward. "My men are subduing her. We'll stage a heart attack later. Much cleaner than a burglary. But you are a loose end, Shannon." He raised the gun. "Why?" Shannon asked, her voice shaking. "Why kill your own family? You have billions already." "It's not about the money," Charles spat, his face twisting into a sneer. "It's about the legacy. My father was the eldest. The company should have been his. But Catherine, that woman, she bewitched my uncle. She took everything. And then she produced Arthur, the golden boy." "So your father kidnapped him," Shannon said, stalling. She looked around for a weapon, a wrench, a tire iron, anything. "Kidnapped?" Charles laughed. "No, my father was too weak. I did it. I was 18. I lured Arthur to the nursery. I set the fire. I meant for him to die." Shannon's blood ran cold. "You burned a 5-year-old child." "I tried," Charles shouted, his composure cracking. "But the little rat crawled out. He got out the window. I found him in the garden, burned, screaming. I couldn't finish it there. Too many witnesses coming. So I put him in the trunk of my car. I drove him to an orphanage in Scotland. I dropped him on the steps and threatened the nuns that if they ever spoke of his origins, I'd burn their church down." "He remembered," Shannon said. "That's why he wrote the letter." "He remembered too late," Charles said. "He grew up broken, scared. He didn't know who he was until he saw me on TV 20 years later. He tried to contact me, to blackmail me." "So you killed him," Shannon realized. "My father didn't just disappear. You murdered him." "I tied up a loose end." Charles smiled cruelly. "Just like I'm about to do now." He aimed the gun at Shannon's chest. Shannon squeezed her eyes shut, clutching the locket. The sound of an engine roaring to life echoed through the garage. Charles turned his head, distracted for a split second. The headlights of the heavy-armored SUV parked behind Charles blinded him. The car surged forward. It wasn't empty. Robert, the security chief, blood streaming from his head wound, was behind the wheel. He had crawled from the hallway, down the service stairs, and into the backup vehicle. Charles fired a shot, but it pinged harmlessly off the bulletproof windshield. The SUV slammed into Charles, pinning him against the concrete wall with a sickening crunch. He dropped the gun, screaming in agony as his legs were crushed between the bumper and the wall. Shannon scrambled backward, gasping for air. Robert stumbled out of the car, swaying dizzily. He kicked the gun away from Charles's reach. "You're done, Charles," Robert groaned, holding his bleeding side. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting louder. The police. The real police. Shannon ran to the internal door leading back to the house. She had to find Catherine. She sprinted up the stairs, past the unconscious bodies of the mercenaries. She burst into the library. Catherine was sitting in her armchair, holding her chest, gasping for breath. The revolver was on the floor, smoking. Across the room, one of the intruders lay still, a bullet wound in his shoulder. "Catherine!" Shannon cried, falling to her knees beside the old woman. Did you get away?" Catherine whispered, her face pale. "We got him," Shannon sobbed, holding Catherine's hand. "Robert got him. Charles confessed. He confessed to everything." Catherine let out a long, shuddering breath. "Arthur?" "Charles killed him," Shannon said gently. "But we know the truth now. Arthur didn't die in the fire. He lived. He was my father." Catherine closed her eyes, tears leaking out. "He lived. The weeks following the garage siege turned London into a suffocating cage of flash bulbs and shouting. The image of Catherine Pembroke, the untouchable Iron Queen, being wheeled out of her mansion on a stretcher, her hand tightly gripping the fingers of a wine-stained waitress, had been plastered on every newsstand from New York to Tokyo. For Shannon, the transition was violent. She had gone from being invisible to being the most scrutinized woman in England overnight. She was moved into the presidential suite of the Pembroke Hotel, not as a guest, but as a high-value target. Robert's security team guarded the elevators and the stairwells, their earpieces buzzing with constant threats. Outside, the press camped on the sidewalk like a besieging army. The headlines were vicious, fed by a narrative spun by expensive PR firms. The waitress who would be queen. Pembroke Prince arrested, hero or victim. The 40-year lie. Charles Pembroke had survived the crush injury to his legs, though he would never walk unassisted again. But even from his hospital bed in the prison ward, his malice was potent. He had retained a phalanx of 12 lawyers, sharks who specialized in the impossible. Their strategy was brutal and simple: discredit Shannon Miller. They leaked fabricated stories to the tabloids. They claimed Shannon was a struggling actress who had orchestrated a long con on a senile, grief-stricken old woman. They suggested the locket was a clever forgery bought on the black market. They painted Catherine not as a victim, but as a mentally unstable matriarch suffering from dementia-induced hallucinations. Shannon sat at the long mahogany dining table in her suite, staring at a tabloid spread. The photo showed her taking out trash bags behind the Kensington 2 months ago. The caption read, "Gold digger or granddaughter." "They hate me," Shannon whispered, her voice trembling. She pushed the paper away as if it were contaminated. "They think I planned this. They think I'm a criminal." Catherine sat opposite her. She was recovering, but the ordeal had carved new lines into her face. She poured tea with a hand that still shook slightly, but her eyes were steel. "They don't hate you, my dear," Catherine said, her voice sharp. "They are terrified of you. You represent chaos in their orderly world. A waitress becoming a billionaire upsets the natural order of things. It scares them. But fear is a tool if you know how to use it. Today, we silence them." Today was the day of the DNA results. To ensure there could be no accusations of tampering, the test had been conducted by 3 independent laboratories, one in Switzerland, one in the US, and one in the UK. The results were to be read live at a press conference in the grand ballroom of the Pembroke Hotel. The atmosphere in the ballroom was toxic. Hundreds of reporters were packed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the heat of television lights and cynical murmurs. When the double doors opened, the noise stopped instantly. Catherine walked onto the stage first. She leaned heavily on a cane, refusing the wheelchair for this moment. Beside her walked Shannon. She wore a simple navy dress, no jewelry, except for the tarnished platinum locket resting visibly against her chest. She felt like she was walking to the gallows. They reached the podium. Catherine adjusted the microphone. The feedback whine sliced through the silence. "For 40 years," Catherine began, her voice gaining strength with every syllable, "I believed my line had ended. I believed I was working for a ghost. I allowed my nephew, Charles, to prey on a mother's grief to build his own fortune. He called this young woman a fraud. He called her a thief. He tried to kill her to keep his secrets buried." She gestured to the senior attorney standing to her right. He stepped forward, holding a sealed envelope with red wax stamps from 3 different nations. "Open it," Catherine commanded. The sound of the paper tearing was amplified by the microphones. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. He looked at the document, then at the crowd. "The genetic markers," the lawyer announced, his voice booming, "are conclusive across all 3 independent tests. The probability of relation between Catherine Pembroke and Shannon Miller is 99.999%. Furthermore, DNA extracted from the locket, specifically a follicle of hair found preserved in the clasp, matches the profile of Arthur Pembroke." He paused for effect. The results establish, without legal doubt, that Arthur Pembroke is the biological father of Shannon Miller. For a second there was silence. Then the room erupted. It was pandemonium. Reporters were shouting, standing on chairs, flashing cameras like strobe lights. Shannon felt the floor sway beneath her. It was real. It wasn't a fairy tale, and it wasn't a mistake. She wasn't just Shannon the waitress anymore. She was a Pembroke. Catherine turned to her, ignoring the screaming press. She took Shannon's face in her hands, her eyes wet. "Welcome home, Arthur's daughter. Welcome home." It should have been the happy ending. But Charles Pembroke was not a man who allowed happy endings. The victory lasted exactly 24 hours. The next morning, Charles played his final, nuclear card. Facing charges of attempted murder, kidnapping, and the historic manslaughter of Arthur Pembroke, Charles cut a deal. In a pre-trial hearing, in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table, he offered the prosecutors the location of the archive. It turned out, Charles was a hoarder of secrets. For 20 years he had kept meticulous, encrypted records of every illegal deal, every bribe to a zoning official, every act of corporate sabotage, and every tax loophole the Pembroke Corporation had exploited under his influence. He revealed that the empire Catherine thought she was running was actually rotting from the inside out. He did it out of pure spite. If he couldn't rule the empire, he would burn it to ash, so Shannon would inherit nothing but lawsuits and debt. The news broke at noon. By 1 p.m., the stock price of Pembroke hotels had plummeted 40%. By 2 p.m., the board of directors resigned en masse to avoid prosecution. By evening, creditors were calling in loans that totaled into the billions. Shannon sat in the empty boardroom that evening. The large screens on the wall showed red graphs, crashing downward like waterfalls. The phone on the table had been ringing non-stop for hours until Robert finally unplugged it. "He's won," Shannon whispered, staring at the ruin. "He's actually done it. He's destroyed everything from his jail cell." She looked at her hands. Rough hands, workers' hands. "I'm not an heiress, Catherine. I'm the captain of a sinking ship. I should leave. You should sell what's left and retire. I can go back. Catherine sat at the head of the table. She looked at the numbers, then at the weeping willow outside the window, and finally at Shannon. "A ship only sinks if the captain stops bailing water," Catherine said softly. "I am too old to fight this war, Shannon. I built this company on the old ways. Ruthlessness, fear, silence. That is what allowed a creature like Charles to thrive. That is why we are here." She slid a heavy binder across the table. It was the list of employees, thousands of them. Maids, valets, chefs, doormen. "We need something new," Catherine said. "We need you." "I'm a waitress," Shannon cried, standing up, panic rising in her chest. "I know how to balance a tray, not a multinational conglomerate. I don't know how to save a billion-dollar company." "You know how to work," Catherine corrected, her voice hard and unyielding. "You know what it's like to worry about rent. You know what it's like to be invisible. You know what it's like to clean up someone else's mess. That is exactly the perspective this company hasn't had in a century. The experts ruined us, Shannon. Maybe a waitress can save us." Shannon looked down at the binder. She thought of her friends in the kitchen at the Kensington. She thought of her mother, dying without insurance. She thought of her father, burning in a fire set by a man who thought he was better than everyone else. Charles wanted her to run. He wanted her to be scared. He wanted the Pembroke legacy to die with him. Shannon reached up and touched the locket. The metal was warm. "Don't try to be me," Catherine said gently. "Be Shannon." Shannon took a deep breath. She sat back down. She opened the binder. "Okay," Shannon said, her voice steadying. "If we're going to survive, we need to sell the jets. And the yachts. And we're going to tell the truth to the shareholders. All of it." Catherine smiled. "Let's get to work." 365 days. That was how long it had been since the wine glass shattered, the locket swung free, and the world tilted on its axis. The grand ballroom of the Pembroke Hotel had been restored, but it no longer felt like a mausoleum of old money and cold silence. The heavy, suffocating velvet drapes had been replaced with airy, cream-colored silk that caught the light. The scent of beeswax and fear was gone, replaced by fresh lilies and the murmur of genuine conversation. Tonight was the grand reopening, a night the financial pundit said would never happen. Shannon Miller Pembroke stood on the mezzanine balcony, hidden in the shadows of a marble pillar, looking down at the sea of tuxedos and gowns. She adjusted the cuff of her tailored white suit. Her hair, once pulled back in a messy Waitress bun, was now a sharp, chic bob that framed her face. She looked powerful. She looked like she belonged, but beneath the bespoke suit, her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It had been a year of war. The newspapers called it a Cinderella story, but there had been no fairy godmother waving a wand. There had only been Shannon, sitting in boardrooms until 3 a.m., staring at spreadsheets that bled red ink. Charles hadn't just stolen money, he had poisoned the company's soul. To save it, Shannon had to make choices that made her hands shake. She remembered the day she signed the order to sell the private jet fleet. The old guard executives had looked at her with horror. "But how will we travel to the summits, Miss Pembroke?" one had sneered. "Commercial," Shannon had replied, not looking up from the document. "Or you can walk. We have debts to pay." She had liquidated the yachts in Monaco. She had sold the 2 vacation estates in the Hamptons. She had stripped the company down to its bones to pay off the creditors Charles had courted. Then she fired the entire executive level, men who had looked the other way, while Charles burned the legacy and promoted the people who actually knew how the hotels ran. The floor managers, the head housekeepers, the concierges. The gamble had worked. The stock price hadn't just recovered, it was soaring. The public didn't want another faceless corporate monolith. They wanted the Waitress CEO. They wanted the girl who knew the value of $1. "You look nervous," a soft voice rasped behind her. Shannon turned. Catherine Pembroke sat in a motorized wheelchair, a tartan blanket draped over her knees. The Iron Queen was thinner now, her skin like parchment paper, but her eyes were clear. The fog of grief and medication that had clouded her for decades had finally lifted. "The gala is starting," Shannon said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There are 600 people down there. Investors. Press. They're all waiting for the speech." "They are waiting for you," Catherine corrected, a small, proud smile touching her lips. "I'm just the old relic in the corner now, a piece of history." Shannon knelt beside the wheelchair, taking her grandmother's frail hand. The skin was cool to the touch. "You're not a relic. You're the reason I'm here. You saved my life, Catherine. You saved me from that interrogation room when no one else would look at me." Catherine shook her head slowly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "No, child. You saved my soul. I was drowning in hate, Shannon. For 40 years, I sat in this house and let the darkness eat me alive. I let Charles turn into a monster because I was too busy mourning a ghost. You gave me back the light. You gave me back my son. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom groaned open below. The murmur of the crowd rose in anticipation. "Are you ready?" Catherine asked. Shannon took a deep breath. She reached up and touched the locket, which rested visibly against her chest. It was polished now, the silver gleaming, the ivy pattern sharp and distinct. "Yes," Shannon said, standing up. "Let's go." Shannon pushed Catherine's wheelchair toward the elevator. As they descended, the noise grew louder. When the doors opened, the applause hit them like a physical wave. It was deafening. Flashbulbs popped in a blinding staccato rhythm. Shannon pushed her grandmother to the center of the stage. She locked the wheels and stepped to the podium. She looked out at the faces, some friendly, some calculating, but all attentive. "A year ago," Shannon began, her voice amplifying clearly through the speakers, "I spilled a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir on a tablecloth in this very room." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. "I was terrified," Shannon continued, her expression serious. "I was terrified of losing my job. I was terrified of not making rent. I was invisible. I didn't know that my history, my identity, and my father's love were hanging around my neck the whole time." She touched the locket again, a grounding gesture. "My father, Arthur Pembroke, never got to stand here. He never got to lead this company. He was taken from us by greed, by jealousy, and by silence. For a long time, this family was defined by what we hid." Shannon gestured to the back wall of the stage. The velvet curtain rose slowly. "But today, we are defined by what we reveal." Revealed on the wall was a massive oil painting. It wasn't of Catherine in her prime, or of the stern ancestors who usually lined the halls. It was a portrait reconstructed from old photographs, and Shannon's own likeness. It showed a young man with kind, laughing eyes, holding a baby girl in a sunlit garden. It was Arthur, and he looked happy. "This is the new Pembroke way," Shannon announced, her voice ringing with authority. "We are not just a hotel company anymore. We are a family. And in this family, we don't look down on the people who serve the wine. We look them in the eye. We ask their names, because you never know who they might be." The silence held for a heartbeat, and then the room erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a thunderous ovation. People stood. Some were wiping their eyes. Catherine reached up from her wheelchair and squeezed Shannon's hand, holding on tight. Hours later, long after the champagne had been drunk and the investors had been charmed, the estate grew quiet. The last limousine taillights had faded down the driveway. Shannon changed out of her suit and into a thick wool coat. She wheeled Catherine out the back doors, into the private garden that bordered the edge of the estate. The rain had stopped, leaving the air smelling of wet earth and pine. They stopped at the family plot, beneath the shadow of a weeping willow. There was a new gravestone there, cut from simple, unpolished granite, placed right next to Catherine's husband, Arthur J. Pembroke, beloved son, father, and prince in hiding. 1981, 2004. The moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the inscription. Shannon didn't cry. She had shed enough tears to fill an ocean over the last year. Instead, she felt a profound, settling peace. Charles was in a maximum security cell, serving 3 consecutive life sentences. The archive of his crimes had been burned. The lies were over. Catherine leaned forward and placed a single white rose on the cold stone. Her hand lingered there for a long moment, trembling slightly. "I can rest now," Catherine whispered to the stone, her voice barely audible over the wind. I really can. I found her, Arthur. I kept my promise. Shannon wrapped her arm around her grandmother's shoulders, protecting her from the chill. Not just yet, Grandma. We have the quarterly board meeting on Monday, at 9 sharp. Catherine let out a dry, raspy laugh, a sound that hadn't been heard in the Pembroke Manor for decades. You are a tyrant, just like me. And, Shannon added, a mischievous glint in her eye, I have an executive order regarding the staff. We're changing the uniforms. The polyester blend is a crime against humanity, and those shoes are torture. If I'm going to run this empire, my staff is going to have comfortable feet. Catherine looked up at Shannon, her eyes crinkling with genuine mirth. You really are my granddaughter. God help the board. Come on, Shannon said gently, turning the wheelchair around. Let's go inside. It's cold. The two women, the Iron Queen and the Waitress, moved back toward the warm, golden lights of the manor. The wind rustled through the ivy on the high stone walls, and for a fleeting second, it didn't sound like wind at all. It sounded like a breath released. A whisper. Thank you. Shannon pressed her hand against the locket. The metal was warm against her skin, pulsing with a heartbeat that had finally found its rhythm. The dynasty was safe. The secret was out. And the girl who used to serve the wine was now pouring a new future. This story reminds us that the truth is a force of nature. You can bury it, burn it, or hide it behind a wall of money, but it will always find a way to the light. Catherine Pembroke spent 40 years grieving a lie, while Charles Pembroke spent a lifetime building a castle on sand. In the end, it wasn't a lawyer or a detective who brought down a corrupt empire. It was a simple silver locket and the courage of a girl who refused to let go of her history. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It helps us bring more of these incredible true crime-style dramas to life. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a twist. What would you do if you found out you were the secret heir to a billion-dollar fortune? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.